Color changes everything. It can shift a feeling, capture a mood, or bring a story to life. With the right grade, even the simplest moments can feel cinematic. But achieving that polished filmic look isn't always easy. Color grading is one of the most challenging crafts to master as a filmmaker, and with endless variables, rules, and creative decisions available, it's easy for it to become a major bottleneck in post-production. It took us years of experimenting, learning about IRE values, broadcast safe colors, and natural skin tones to achieve a look we were happy with, and even longer to refine it into the grades we use across our films today. Coming off the release of our Chroma Cine LUTs, we wanted to share the exact techniques and tools we use, practical, actionable tips to help you get the most out of our LUTs, or any LUTs, and elevate your grades quickly and confidently. And even if LUTs aren't part of your workflow, these techniques will give you a stronger foundation for crafting beautiful cinematic grades. In this tutorial, we'll cover everything from dialing in the perfect contrast and achieving flawless skin tones, to manipulating individual colors to create your own unique look. We'll also show you how to adapt our LUTs to footage shot in Sony S-Log3 Cine and Canon C-Log3. Since many of you are here because of our Chroma Cine LUTs, I did want to quickly touch on the intent behind the pack. If you'd rather jump straight into the grading tips, feel free to skip into the next section. We designed our LUTs specifically for Canon C-Log2 to give you consistent results with minimal tweaking. They reflect a style we've been honing for years. Vibrant, warm, and punchy, with carefully balanced tones, and include 3 core looks that form the foundation of every wedding and commercial we shoot. When used with C-Log2 footage, you can easily stick to the basic corrections in Lumetri or your primaries color wheels in DaVinci Resolve and achieve the look seen in our films. But if you want to go further, the tips we'll cover today will provide you with the tools to transform your footage into images that feel cinematic, polished, and uniquely your own. So let's not waste another second. These are the techniques that will help you master your color grades. Our first tip is simple: use your scopes. If you're grading without them, you're doing it blind. Even with a calibrated monitor, scopes are your only true objective reference for color and exposure. We rely on 3. The waveform, which shows the luminance of your shot with shadows at the bottom and highlights at the top. We keep it set to luma so it's strictly displaying our exposure. The RGB parade, which shows the red, green, and blue channels of your image separately. We generally want these balanced, but don't obsess over perfect symmetry. A sunset will lean red in the highlights, a natural landscape will push green in the midtones, and dance floors, there'll be chaos. And lastly, the vector scope, which displays color and saturation. The further a color value moves from the center, the more saturated it is. The first square is broadcast safe at 75% saturation, and the second represents full saturation. For web, you're fine between the two, but we aim to stay as close to broadcast safe as possible. This is also where you'll find the skin tone line. We'll dig into that later. In Premiere, you can find the scopes under Window, Lumetri Scopes. In Resolve, they're always visible on the color page, and honestly, Resolve scopes are some of the clearest and easiest to read. The bottom line is that scopes are your truth tellers. Learn to read them and your grades will be more consistent, accurate, and repeatable. Now that we're ready to grade a clip, the first thing you'll want to do is get your exposure and white balance locked in before worrying about contrast, skin tones, or creative color. If these aren't dialed in, nothing else will sit right. Here's a shot of Vic from our C80 review. I'll drag Lumetri color onto the clip, and something to keep in mind is that your order of operations matters. Adjustments made above the LUT affect the raw clip, while adjustments made below affect the LUT applied image. Because I want the flexibility to change the exposure and white balance of our raw clip, I'll load our LUT in the creative section of our Lumetri effect, instead of the input LUT section at the top. I'm gonna go with Signature. This is a vibrant, modern, cinematic look that we've developed over the past year. I'll choose the Vivid version, which is a more saturated rendition of the base look, and apply it. And because our LUTs are optimized for C-Log2, and this is a C-Log2 clip, I don't need to touch the intensity or saturation controls in this section. Honestly, I like how this looks straight away. I'll just warm it up slightly, pushing the temperature a notch or 2. I like a warm image, so let's just go for 3 here. This feels really natural and organic to me with just that simple white balance push, so I'll say that's done. Let's try another example with this shot of Marissa and Josh. I'll go down to the Creative tab, and this time I'll add our filmic look. And Okay, so here I can see that this shot's a little underexposed and on the cooler side. After taking a second to berate myself for these mistakes, I'll go up to the basic correction section and make a small exposure lift. I don't like what 0.2 does to Josh's forehead, so I'm going to go down to 0.1. If I want to double check my exposure, I can mask Marissa's face and reference our waveform. For Caucasian skin tones, I'm generally aiming for 60 to 70 IRE, while darker skin tones will hover around 50. I can also go higher if I want a punchier commercial look, but for a cinematic image, 60 to 70 is the sweet spot. Next, I'll warm things up and add a touch of magenta to balance out the green. It's between 1 and 1.5, so let's just cut the difference and do 1.2 on the tint. Lastly, let's check our waveform again. I usually like blacks between 1 to 5 IRE and highlights peaking around 90. Skies and bright light sources can push higher, but if we're going for cinematic, film is known for its controlled and smooth highlight roll-off. So first, I'll bring down the black slightly and tame the highlights with a curves adjustment. By adding a few cutoff points and lowering just the highlights toward that 90 IRE mark, I can control the brightest areas without shifting the whole exposure. Now everything beyond that initial exposure and white balance adjustment was optional, but it's these subtle tweaks that elevate your work and give it that refined professional finish. If you're working in Resolve, there's no direct exposure controls, but the approach is the same. Place a node before your LUT and use the primaries to set your exposure and white balance. With your exposure and white balance set, you're already 80% of the way there. Get these two dials right at the start, and everything you do to your look afterwards will fall into place much more naturally. Okay, before we move past white balance, here's one last tip. I pulled up this shot of Nikki and Dave to show you a way to nail white balance objectively. If you have something white in your frame, on wedding days that's usually a dress shirt, you can use the eyedropper on the brightest part to set an accurate white balance. Remember, order matters. Use it above the LUT and you're reading the raw clip, pretty close to what we had already set. But if we add another lumetri effect below our LUT, you're sampling after the look's been applied, giving us a completely different reading. So our next step in grading is dialing in our contrast. We've already touched on this with Marissa and Josh's clip. We know the IRE values we're aiming for, and if our image isn't there yet, we have two main tools to lean on. Our basic corrections panel for above LUT corrections, and our color wheels for below LUT adjustments. Our LUTs are doing most of the heavy lifting when it comes to contrast, so these tools are just for fine-tuning. Let's start with this shot of Bridget and Michael. This shot is looking perfect with this small exposure push, but for the sake of demonstration, let's try out a maximalist approach. In basic correction, the blacks and whites parameters set the darkest and brightest points in the image, while the shadows and highlights tweak the ranges in between. The wider the gap between your highlights and shadows, the punchier your image. While this look we just created is fine, I'm going to stick with the original and simply nudge our blacks into place. But instead of leaning on the basic correction panel, I prefer to use the color wheels for subtle contrast pushes. They're faster, more tactile, and give you a more natural result. Take this shot of Emily and Miles practicing their first dance by the lake. I've applied the archive LUT, set my white balance and exposure, bumped the saturation, and in the basic corrections, I'm just going to lift the shadows a tad so that we gain a little detail in their faces above our LUT. I'll then head down to the color wheels to lower the shadows and raise the midtones slightly to avoid the image feeling crushed. While I rarely do so, you can also use the color wheels to alter the look. You can push warmth into the shadows or accent the sunset with some red. Our LUTs handle most of the creative gray, but this option is always available. Let's do another quick one. Marissa getting ready. After applying the -2 archive LUT, a softer contrast version of the base look, all I have to do is pull down the highlights slightly to get our skin tone into our ideal range. And finally, let's tackle a tougher situation. Britt and Alex's recessional in the harsh sun. I'm starting with a -2 signature LUT, then balancing with the wheels. I'll bring down the highlights, pull the midtones down until the image starts looking natural, and bring the shadows up slightly. I'll give the midtones a tiny push lower, and I'll check that our skin's on target. That looks good to me, but I'm gonna just add some warmth to bring it to life. There. As you can see, contrast is all about subtlety. Small adjustments go a long way in creating a polished cinematic image. Before moving on to more complex adjustments, here's a quick tip. Use the RGB curves to keep highlight color cast in check. Canon footage especially tends to push reds into skies, shirts, anything living on the top end of your waveform. Our LUTs already compensate for this, but if an unwanted cast sneaks into your highlights, there's an easy fix. Take this shot of Josh with his groomsmen. There's a subtle red cast in his shirt and the sky. I'm just going to open up the RGB curves, set 4 key points on the red curve, and gently pull down the highlights until the whites look balanced. Now we've arrived at one of the most powerful tools for dialing in your grade, the hue curves. These let you target virtually any color in your frame and adjust their hue, saturation, and brightness with precision. Let's start by using our hue versus hue and hue versus saturation curves to perfect skin tones. Here's the same shot of Bridget and Michael from earlier. I've drawn a mask over Bridget's face, and because we balanced this image with a touch of green during white balance, her skin is leaning slightly yellow. This is totally passable, but I prefer for it to sit right on the skin tone line. So I'll head down to my hue versus hue curve, grab the eyedropper tool, sample the midtones in her face, and raise that point on the curve until her skin sits perfectly on the skin tone line. This looks great, but now I'm noticing these street lights near the bottom of the frame are pushing beyond the broadcast safe saturation. Switching to the hue versus saturation curve, I'll pull those tones closer to target. This will also slightly desaturate Bridget and Michael's skin since these hues share the same range, but not drastically, so we're good to go here. For a more dramatic example, in this shot of Marissa and Josh, our hue versus hue curve completely removes the strong green cast in their skin tones. But hue curves aren't just for skin, you can alter any color in your frame. Maybe I want to make the water in Emily and Miles' shot more vibrant, or highlight the painting behind Ashley and Peter because it was a meaningful detail in their story. One of the most practical uses, however, is reining in our greens. I find that Canon's greens often need a little nudge away from red for richer, more natural tones and better color separation. Our Chroma Cine LUTs already handle this in most situations, but let's look at some edge cases. Take this shot of Nikki and Dave from earlier. It only needed a white balance tweak, but because it just rained, the grass is looking a little wild saturation-wise, presenting a prime opportunity to use our hue versus saturation curves to pull it back. Instead of using the eyedropper, I'm going to cheat a little since I know that grass hues usually live within these 2 squares. And because grass covers a wide tonal range and I want to avoid any weird artifacts, I'm going to set a few additional points to make a smoother curve. This is giving us a better balance visually, but I can see on the vector scope that we have a harsh cutoff as we transition into the yellow greens, so I'll sample their skin tones to keep them safe from our next adjustment, and I'll push this point slightly towards yellow to smooth the gradient. A quick check to make sure Nikki's hair is not affected, and we're set. Last example, Tina and Aaron's ceremony. We went warm with this grade, so the grass is looking a tad muddy. A subtle tweak with the hue versus hue curve adds separation, and a light saturation drop cleans it up. If you're using Resolve, adjusting your hue curves is even easier. Values are displayed numerically, your changes are curved automatically, and you can zoom in, which makes all the difference when fine-tuning your grade. One curve we didn't touch on is the hue versus luma curve, which adjusts the brightness of a selected hue. In practice, we rarely use it because our next tool offers more control and better results in the long run. The tool we're talking about is the HSL secondary effect, which lets you isolate and adjust specific colors based on their hue, saturation, and luminance, making it our go-to tool for fine-tuning. It looks intimidating at first, but once you got the basics, it's fast, powerful, and more accurate than our hue curves. Let's revisit the shot of Marissa and Josh under the veil, and this time, let's fix the green cast on their skin with HSL. I'll grab the eyedropper, sample their skin tones, and I'll click Show Mask to check the initial selection. Next, I'll use the Add Color eyedropper to refine it and include as much of their skin as possible. You can also use the hue, saturation, and luminance sliders to fine-tune your coverage, but the eyedropper's got us where we need to be this time. I'll smooth out the selection by setting denoise to 40 and blur to 3, and now we're ready to adjust. For skin tones, we're usually focused on tint and saturation. I'll start with the tint, which in this case, the sweet spot seems to be 14, and the saturation looks good, so I'll leave it as is. Above these controls are our color wheels. I'm going to drop the highlights slightly since Josh is looking a bit bright, and I'll add some subtle contrast in their skin by lowering the shadows. There. This is one of HSL's biggest advantages. We can tweak our skin exposure and color independently, giving us the freedom to adjust our overall shot while keeping our skin within our target values. It's also perfect for small fixes, like making dress shirts appear crisp white in shots with heavy blue casts, or dealing with those bright streetlights from earlier without affecting Bridget and Michael's skin tones. If you're in Resolve, the approach is similar but a bit broader. You create a new node, use the qualifier tool, which looks like an eyedropper, and make your HSL selection. Then, any adjustments you make within that node will only affect your selection. Now let's look at this next shot as a culmination of everything we've covered so far. We missed the white balance initially, so we corrected that first. We raised shadows for more detail above our LUT, brought down the highlights for a smoother roll-off on Kalinka's shoulder. We used our hue curves to push the greens towards a richer tone and cap their saturation, then used our color wheels to lower the blacks, and finally used HSL to perfect skin tones, adding shape by darkening the shadows slightly. Alright, one last tool in our color grading arsenal, and it's a bit of a gift and a curse, because once you start using masks, you realize you can tweak your image in almost infinite ways, and the only limit is time. With masks, we can isolate a subject or background and dial in their exposure and color independently, create subtle vignettes or lighting effects that guide the viewer's eye exactly where you want, and transform specific elements like skies, clothing, and skin tones into the perfect color without touching anything else in the frame. Let's go back to Marissa and Josh under the veil one last time. If you've been watching closely, you may have noticed a Lumetri layer sitting above the one we've been using and thought we were being shady. Instead, we were actually isolating and tracking Marissa, bumping her exposure to better match Josh's. Because of the warm orange glow in the background, isolating Kalinka's skin tones in this shot without affecting the backdrop was impossible, so we used a mask to isolate her from the ceremony space and dialed in her tones with HSL. Masks are super easy to set up. We'll just drag another Lumetri effect above or below our correction layer. From there, we can choose an ellipse or rectangle mask, or grab the pen tool for a custom shape. For this example, let's just keep it simple with an ellipse. I'll resize it, and if Premiere's feeling generous, it'll keyframe the mask path for us. In this case, we lucked out, but it doesn't always work, so be prepared to make your own keyframes, and keep in mind that if your shot is still or features very subtle movement, you might not need to animate your path at all. Anyways, with our mask locked in, we can use any Lumetri tool to grade inside the mask, or we can hit invert to adjust everything outside of it. We could spend hours on the insane things we've done with masks, like how we adapted our filmic look for the Tiki's Pigments campaign, where we had to mask nearly every single piece of clothing for color-accurate results. But we'll leave that rabbit hole for another day. And if you're still doing most of your edits in Premiere like us and want to witness something truly crazy, Resolve's mask tracking is absolutely bananas. Alright, that wraps up our core color grading techniques. With all the tools we've covered, you now have everything you need to take control of your footage, whether you're simply tweaking white balance, dialing in the perfect skin tones, or masking up a storm. Since the release of our Chroma Cine LUTs though, we've been getting a lot of questions about how to match different C-Log2 cameras and adapting these looks to Sony S-Log3 and Canon C-Log3. So let's shift gears a bit and walk through how to get consistent results in these scenarios. Let's start with the easiest grading situation, matching C-Log2 cameras. Thanks to the work we've put into our LUTs, this should be pretty much drag and drop, assuming that your footage is properly exposed and white balanced. But let's take a look at Nikki and Dave's vow exchange. I've already graded the wide shot from our C80 using the vivid version of our signature LUT, and I adjusted white balance and brought exposure down a bit. That's all I had to do to get this clip where I want. Now let's match Nikki's close-up from the C70. This clip has no corrections, just the signature look applied. We did shoot a little warm in general, which we've already corrected on the wide shot, so we'll fix that here as well after setting our exposure. Nikki's already masked, and I can see that we're slightly bright. So I'll drop the exposure, and I'll toggle the comparison view to see both shots side by side. Yeah, it looks like this is mostly a white balance adjustment, so I'm going to cool it down slightly. That feels good, and add a touch of magenta to balance things out. Now I'm looking at her hair and his neck in both shots, and we're nearly there. Next, I'll bring down those C70 DGO shadows with the wheels, and that adds some saturation, so I'll pull that back by 2 at the top. Done. 95% of the time, matching different camera models is going to come down to small white balance and tint adjustments, but the biggest thing to look out for is contrast. While small color shifts can fly under the radar, mismatched contrast stands out immediately. Make sure your contrast levels are consistent and your grades will feel seamless. Now, a lot of our assistants shoot Sony, so we're no strangers to matching our looks to Sony S-Log3 Cine footage. In fact, we've made a Sony-specific reel for our Chroma Cine LUTs. Let's take a quick look at how we graded these shots. The first thing that stands out with Sony footage when compared to Canon is the color. Greens tend to be richer, while skin tones tend to skew orange. We also noticed that a lot of Sony shooters massively overexpose their footage, so I already know going in that I'm going to be pulling the exposure down, adding contrast, and pushing magenta into the skin tones and greens to balance things out. Let's start with a clip we have a clear visual reference for, Nikki and Dave in their backyard. I'll apply our signature LUT, and wow, that will never not be crazy to me. Honestly, I wouldn't expect to recover Canon footage from this level of overexposure, but Sony holds up surprisingly well. So I'll bring it down. 1.2 is feeling right. Now I'll set the white balance. Yeah, that looks good on his shirt. I'm going to cheat here because I know once I add contrast, the colors will get more vivid. And while I could apply the muted version of signature, which would naturally tame saturation, for the sake of speed, I'm just going to drop the saturation to 94 up here in the basic corrections. Heading down to the color wheels, I'll bring down shadows and midtones. Then make some quick hue adjustments to address those color differences I mentioned. Nudging red and orange hues up slightly, doing the same with greens, and desaturating both. This is already looking solid for a quick pass, but I'm just going to check my skin tones and exposure with a mask I've already created. Yeah, and I see I can push it a little more, so I'll just add a 5 to my highlights. Once you've dialed in this correction, it's just a matter of pasting it across the rest of your shots and tweaking white balance or exposure as needed. These shots have already been graded, but I just want to show you that beyond that initial adaptation, all we've done is small tweaks in our basic corrections to get them to 100%. In our own workflow, we'll always keep a project handy with our Sony adjustments, so we can always copy these settings over and go from there. Lastly, let's take a look at C-Log3. This one's pretty much a perfect match after a few quick tweaks. Here's that shot of Vic from the C80 review again. Because this was shot in RAW, we're able to interpret one clip as C-Log2 and the other as C-Log3 for a direct comparison. And honestly, toggling between the two, this is insanely close. C-Log3 is a much narrower curve than C-Log2, so when our C-Log2 LUT is applied, it's going to crush the blacks and blow out our highlights. To fix that, we just have to make a contrast adjustment to our clip above the LUT to get it closer to the C-Log2 color space. For reference, these exact settings have been working for us universally. We use the -2 contrast version of any Chroma LUT, lift the shadow significantly to around 50 or 51, and bring down the highlights, whites, and blacks to these values. Then in the color wheels, we give the blacks one final push into the 1 to 5 IRE range. And if we paste these over to our C-Log3 interpreted shots, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference from the C-Log2 originals. And that's our wrap on this deep dive into color grading and getting the most out of our Chroma Cine LUTs, or really, any LUTs you're working with. Hopefully you're walking away with plenty of practical techniques you can start using right now to give your grades a polished filmic look. If you haven't grabbed them yet and want to simplify your grading workflow, our Chroma Cine LUTs are designed to give your footage a warm, vivid, cinematic look straight out of the box, and as you've seen in this video, they're a super versatile drag-and-drop solution for Canon cameras and easily adaptable to Sony S-Log3 and other profiles. You can check them out via the link in the description. For those who prefer a Rec. 709 LUT, we'll actually be releasing an updated version of our Mosaic Legacy LUTs in the next few weeks, which will include a collection of 3 completely different looks optimized for Rec. 709, so definitely keep an eye out for that. If you found this breakdown helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and head on over to Instagram and throw us a follow if you'd like to see more behind the scenes of our work and daily life. Thanks for watching, guys. Till next time.